All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Westchester Community for Ethical Culture. So, my name is Greg Duros. I set up the speaker series. This is our second year going strong. When I discovered Anna Sachs on Instagram, I immediately wanted her to speak here at the EC, at the Ethical Community. Um, Me personally, as a believer in the belief that buying less is more, and being concerned about climate change, I was shocked at the problem she was exposing and intrigued at her practical solutions. And it's impressive the amount of attention she has brought to the issues of waste and consumption. So let me tell you a little bit about Anna Sachs. She's a waste expert focused on passing legislation in NYC and raising consciousness on social media, posting as the trash walker to her 500,000 followers on TikTok, Instagram, and other sites. Anna documents the usable items that she finds in both corporate and residential waste to raise people's consciousness about waste and consumption. Her work has been featured in The Guardian, New York Times, Now This, BuzzFeed, and several others. She's the legislative chair for the Manhattan Solid Waste Advisory Board and one of the founders of NYC's Save Our Compost Coalition. She previously worked at the waste consulting firm Think Zero on a regenerative farm through the Adama Jewish Farming Fellowship and as an analyst at an investment bank. In 2020, she was named a 36 under 36 recipient by the Jewish Week. So, without further ado, Anna Sachs.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for having me here. So, thank you for that introduction. I don't need to introduce myself anymore. Um, I want to talk a little bit about my career shift. I was working at an investment bank doing mergers and acquisitions and capital raises, very corporate-y, and I felt burned out after a couple of years there. So I did this Jewish farming fellowship, which is located in Falls Village, Connecticut, and it really challenged these assumptions that I had about how to live, how we are living, what is the goal, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But wanted to transition my career afterwards without going to grad school. And one of the ways in which I was able to do that was through social media. So I started going on these trash walks around my neighborhood, basically on recycling nights. I would walk around just looking at the streets and taking out usable items and documenting it and posting it on social media, both as a record for myself and also to gain credibility when I had a very confusing resume. So it was also a way for me to connect with my neighbors, and I've been able to make friends with people who I never would have met otherwise just through being out and about in my neighborhood. It's a reason for me to walk outside, especially in the winter when I don't otherwise want to. And there's this thrill of the hunt and experience of flow where I might be out for 4 hours walking around, going through trash bags. And at the end, it feels like a blink of the eye, really. It feels like I have only been out for an hour at most. And I also feel like I'm an amateur sleuth, which I will get into. So I started with corporate waste initially with these trash walks, and then quickly became interested in I started with residential waste and quickly became interested in corporate waste. In New York City, which is different than other places like here, the majority of corporations leave their waste on the sidewalks, which makes it accessible versus having it behind a locked fence or having it in a compactor where you really can't get to it. And so I started looking at CVS's waste in particular, especially because they're this huge corporation with over 10,000 stores, and they have this mission for doing good. And the items that they're tossing are so essential. So I started really going after them and saying, like, this, what's happening is not acceptable, what they're tossing. So corporations will toss different items for different reasons. One is external packaging damage. So you could see here, these tampons are still sealed, but the corner is bent. The tubes of toothpaste are still sealed, they're still unopened, but they're not something that CVS wants to have on their shelves because the external packaging looks bad, and so they will toss it. And it's important to note that employees are not allowed to take it home. That is considered theft, and they can be fired for doing so. And the employees are not allowed to donate it. Also, that could also be considered theft. Sometimes it's just excess over ordering. Whenever I find a trash bag of just a single item, I always check for recalls. In this instance, it was gummy worms. This is a photo from a long time ago. So at the time, it was very far from its best buy date. And there were no recalls on this. There was no reason for it to have been tossed. It was just an issue of like, they didn't estimate properly how much demand there would actually be. So that's another reason for corporations to toss items. Another thing is expiring soon. This was an instance of Kit Kats reaching their best buy date. So the best buy date, what's important for people to understand is the only thing that's federally required to have a best buy date is baby food. And that's because you want to make sure your baby is having enough nutrients, and that's a guarantee that the nutrients are up to that quality. But everything else is put there voluntarily by the corporation. Some states do have additional requirements, mostly related to like food, to dairy and meat. But Kit Kats, to my knowledge, chocolate, like no state is regulating chocolate. So it's a date that corporations put there indicating the peak quality because they want you to have the best experience eating that candy bar. So corporations will have a very conservative best by date, and then the retailer like CVS will add another layer of conservatism to it. So they'll toss it 1 month typically or 2 months ahead of that best by date. In this instance, I think it was like 70 bags of Kit Kats. It was huge. Baked Daily, this is the flip side of Baked Daily, which is very hidden, unfortunately. But if you go to a bagel shop or a bakery or Dunkin' Donuts and open up their trash bag after they close, you'll oftentimes find the items that didn't sell in the trash. I think bread is a great area for source reduction. The truth is, it doesn't, we overproduce it systemically. It doesn't last very long. It goes stale pretty quickly. It's not nutritionally dense, and there's a limit to the amount that different shelters can accept. A lot of times, shelters will be like, we actually have too much bread. We don't need any more. Baked Daily, same thing, donuts. I did a back of the envelope calculation for Dunkin' Donuts. I brought home 2 bags of their trash, which were just filled with their donuts and pastries. I weighed them, so it was 48 pounds from that one location. There are over 12,000 locations in the US, and we have 365 days per year. So they are, at that calculation, they're overproducing by 225 million pounds of food. But if you want to be even more conservative, you could say they're overproducing by over 100 million pounds per year. And that's something that's built into their model. They require that you have a certain amount, a certain variety available at all times. And I think that needs to shift. So it needs, the future that I envision might be that we don't have this overabundance of items. We might have more limited choices, but we need to do that because the alternative is this extreme amount of waste. Anything related to past holidays is typically discarded by corporations. So this is Hanukkah wrapping paper that a CVS discarded. It's actually, CVS has direct control over their own branded merchandise. This instance was, I think, American Greeting. And American Greeting has an employee, in addition to like restocking the shelves, to take away any of the unsold merchandise related to the past holiday. And when they do that, they have to use scissors or razors to slash it first and then to discard it. That's very typical. So one common argument I hear about donations is that it really takes a lot of time. And I want to say, yes, it does take time. But also destruction takes time. And so in this one time, there was this after like the holidays, Christmas, Hanukkah, I met one of these employees whose job it is to go to like every of the retailers and destroy it. And I'm sure she spent over an hour destroying merchandise, ripping it up, and she didn't even finish it, which was good for me because I was able to salvage what was left. But um, yeah, destruction also takes time, and there's the emotional cost of the person required to destroy. Sometimes it's ordered by the vendors. This is Foster Grant, where they're one of the largest glasses manufacturers in the US. They make these reading glasses. And I, at first, was very excited to find this bag of reading glasses in CVS's trash, but then each one was bent. So each one had the actual, like you could see one of the arms missing. And in this instance, there was also the paperwork where it said that if you have 50 pieces or fewer that they're pulling from the shelves, they're required to destroy it. Anything that's returned is typically destroyed and tossed. So it's just important for people to know that. This was in Barnes& Noble's trash. It says, "To Eve, love Nana," after the holidays. So it was someone's Harry Potter wand that they received. They returned it. I don't think they even thought twice about it, about what's going to happen to the return, and then it ended up in the trash. Refrigeration fails. This was Dwayne Reed. Dwayne Reed is owned by Walgreens. And a lot of times I see this where there are just trash bags of everything that was in the freezer section or the refrigerator section. And they're in yeah, they go in the trash. There's no reason other than refrigeration fails. So one thing I would like to see is emergency response protocol, where if you have that situation where your refrigeration has failed for a certain period of time, you deem it no longer safe. You call upon these food rescue groups, and they should be able to pick it up and then connect it with people who could use it. And a lot of times in these instances, it's still cold, but for whatever reason, I'm not sure what their protocol is, for whatever reason, they do toss it. Stores closing, this is another area I would like to see legislation. This was also a Dwayne Reed closing. It was after Halloween, so you can see all the Halloween merchandise. And then this was, I thought, especially outrageous, of the diapers and the medicines, compression stockings, etc. So this a lot of times there isn't that, again, there's like the lack of priorities, lack of protocol, lack of someone overseeing it. There's a rushed process, and the result is everything being tossed into the trash. If items are damaged, they'll be discarded. So Victoria's Secrets, they destroy items that are returned and items that are what they consider damaged. So in this example, it was smelly. And then a lot of times, like I said, you spend time destroying. And so they'll be using scissors or razors to destroy it to make sure no one can use it. Legitimate is also legitimate, which I try to set aside, is those recalls. In this instance, there were all these RX bars that were tossed. It's because they had traces of peanuts and they didn't label it. And that can be dangerous and deadly. But I would say there's a little bit of a caveat where for someone like me who's not allergic to peanuts, I can still eat them. But I do like to try to keep that as like a separate category because I think that muddles the argument. Further upstream, which are like even more hidden from me, are rejected shipments. So this was a case in 2021 when there was a shortage of ventilators around the world, and these new ventilators had arrived, I guess, for the person receiving them didn't want them. They weren't FDA approved, and so they ended up being trashed in a landfill. So a lot of times the rejected shipments, that could be massive. That could be pallets full of unopened, unused goods, and that's even more hidden than what I'm seeing. Further upstream is also warehouses. So Amazon has gotten into a lot of trouble, as it should, for destroying millions of items of unsold stock in their warehouses. And again, this is something where I would love to be able to see it. I would love to be able to access it. It's even more donatable because it's uniform, unopened, unused items. But they are being destroyed, and it actually has led to legislation in France banning that. So that's the umbrella of corporate waste, the reasons why they do. These are some practical suggestions I would like to give for both for like those retailers and for your own corporate setting if you work in a office job. One is if you observe corporate waste, write to the CEO and offer to help find a solution, which is something that I have done with CVS and other corporations. It doesn't always result in anything, but really it's the CEO has the decision-making power, and I like to have that paper trail so that they can know that so they can't feign in ignorance in the future. And it makes me feel better. So it's always good to point out the problem and then also offer to find a solution if they need external help. In your office, I recommend creating a green team. I think that it's very hard for an individual to do anything by themselves in an office setting. And so if you can gather like-minded people and discuss different initiatives you'd like to enact or speaker series, whatever it is, that can make it that can build momentum, make it so that it actually happens. Create reuse protocol for cleaning out a desk/office. When I was working at the waste consulting firm, I would do these waste audits at different office settings and go spend hours going through the trash. And something we saw consistently is when someone was leaving the company, that person just dumped their entire desk contents into the trash. So create protocol, again, identify the problem, create protocol about it so that these usable items are not discarded. Switch to reusables whenever possible. That means that one of the tricky things with reusables is that you might end up with a sink full of dishes that no one wants to do. So create a protocol again about that. If you have a dishwasher, use that. Ask your company if they can to install a dishwasher. Otherwise, have mugs labeled with each person's name so that there is responsibility for whose dirty mug it is. Make sure your recyclables are actually getting recycled. This was another issue we ran into a lot where we would be training the office about how to recycle, what to recycle, why it's important, and then the waste hauling company would combine the trash and recyclables into one truck. When that happens, nothing is actually getting recycled. So what we ended up doing was speaking to the person who works in the loading dock, the security there, who sees the number of trucks that go in and out. And we said, can you let us know if that happens, if they're only sending one truck and if they're combining everything together? And then I went in at 6 a.m. and videotaped the company combining everything together. And then we sent it to their main office and said, this is not acceptable. It's actually against the law. And our clients is paying you to send actually 3 trucks, one for trash, one for recyclables, and one for organics, food material. And then they did correct the issue. So that's one thing to do is you could just ask the hauler, are you actually recycling? Or if your company is an office building with a loading dock, you can ask the security and say how many trucks are coming each night? Or do you see them combining it into one truck? Advocate for composting. So a third of all the waste that we create is compostable. Compostable is material that will break down organically. That could be banana peels, it could be napkins, it could be all of your food scraps, yard waste. And so if you take that out and compost it, you'll be reducing the amount that you send to landfills and incinerators. Composting is especially important because when food material goes to a landfill, it enters into aerobic decomposition, where decomposition. Thank you. You're just checking if you're paying attention. Anaerobic decomposition, where it doesn't get air, and in the process of decomposing, it releases methane, which is a really potent greenhouse gas. So as much as possible, we want to remove those food scraps from going to a landfill. If you have an office cafeteria, find out what happens with uneaten food and advocate for food donation. Important for people to know that since 1996, under Bill Clinton, food donors have been protected under federal law. It's called the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act. and there are no recorded cases of suing for donating food. So, you know, you can donate food. It's a big pervasive myth that the government is preventing that from happening. Absolutely not true. And you also get tax deduction from the government. So those are little things that you can do in your own office setting to try to make it be more sustainable. School waste. I don't know if this maybe it applies to some people with little kids here. Um, but there is a lot of food waste that happens in schools. This was I forget how many, I guess, but like 70 maybe packets of these apples that were cut up and wrapped in plastic and then put in the compost bin. If something's still wrapped in plastic, you can't compost it. And more importantly, they were weeks away from their best by date. So they could be given to students to take home. They could go to a community fridge, find out what happens with your local school, and then advocate for some sort of food sharing program. End of the school year clean out. This follows the theme of stores closing, where whenever you have this big event where you're like, we need to vacate this space, a lot of waste is generated. So something I have found is that the end of the school year and also beginning of the following school year, so it's like usually June, usually August, schools will toss a lot of usable items. So this year I contacted the New York City Department of Education Office of Sustainability, and we partnered with my local Buy Nothing group, and we helped the schools save those items. So if the schools no longer want it, there are a lot of solutions of what you could do. You could set up a free table in the lobby, offer it to students. We have this great nonprofit in New York City called Materials for the Arts. It's basically a warehouse, and educators and artists shop there for free for different art supplies. So if you're making, if you're doing a play, you can get all of your fabric, all of your props from that warehouse for free. So we partner with them this year, and we help transport these usable items to one centralized location where they then went into a truck and went to Materials for the Arts. That was a little bit cumbersome, but it was the solution that the Department of Education was comfortable with. But I really think there's simpler ways to do it involving just a free table, let students take it home for the summer. Unwanted furniture. This oftentimes happens with schools where they're upgrading furniture. This is more difficult because it's so bulky, but there are solutions for it too. I would recommend reaching out to other local schools, or it could be community centers, it could be churches, and saying, "Hey, we have all these, these chairs. Do you want them?" It does take more effort, but I want to let people know that a lot of effort went into creating those chairs. And a lot of effort is also going to go into landfilling or incinerating them. There's effort regardless. Library weeding. This is something that libraries must do to maintain a relevant, vibrant library, where they take out titles that are not being checked out, that contain offensive or outdated materials in it, that are worn, that are moldy. So that makes sense for the materials that shouldn't be in circulation anymore. But a lot of times there are these beautiful books that are totally usable, barely used, and timeless, and they shouldn't go in the trash. So again, in this instance, it was a school on the Upper West Side where I live, and I started pulling out these books, leaving them on a ledge, and people were just stopping casually and taking the books. So it could be something as simple as that. Oh yeah, there you go. So all these people were then stopping and getting the Odyssey and getting Greek myths, etc., etc. So, school suggestions. Discuss the book weeding process with the library. I think you need to acknowledge that weeding is necessary, but what can you do with the books that are still good? Can you do the book weeding before students leave for the break so that they have a chance to take it home for summer reading? Discuss the end of the school year classroom cleanup process with teachers and facilities. It's important that everyone is on the same page. We had an instance this year with that DOE process where teachers set aside materials and then they said facilities tossed it. So it's important that everyone knows what's going on. And I also think that this end of the school year classroom cleanout process shouldn't just be up to teachers. That's really unfair when they don't have time and they don't have the support. So you can, I think you can involve the students. A lot of the tasks are really like somewhat boring but repetitive. Like if you want to, instead of tossing all of the markers, what you have to do is test each one individually and see if it works, which I'm sure people do that at home when they have a lot of pens or a lot of markers, but that's product stewardship. So you can involve students with that process. And I think you can involve the parents, the school board, you can involve parents, you can involve a green team if they have a green team, you can involve local community groups like your Buy Nothing group, but make it so that it's a shared responsibility rather than just falling on teachers. That's not fair. Create protocol for reuse of unwanted usable furniture. So that could be a database so that furniture can easily move around, or a listserv or a Facebook group. But we need to have more infrastructure connecting these unwanted items with people who do want it. Set up donation programs for edible leftover food. You can work with, in New York City, there's a great nonprofit called Rescuing Leftover Cuisine. I used to volunteer with them, and I would pick up food from a local public school, walk it a couple of blocks to a shelter. Host a uniform or other clothing swap. If you have uniforms, there's really no reason why the different families should have to buy so many of them. Host swaps every year. And my friend also started one for Halloween costumes. So every year before Halloween, the school would do a Halloween costume swap. Sorry, there is a beep, but that's okay. Teach creative reuse. So like a lot of times there are these half-used crayons that end up in the trash. And at Materials for the Arts, they will teach teachers how to use these crayons. So one, you can melt them and make a candle out of them because they are made of wax. Two, you could melt them and create this and put them in a silicone mold and create a giant magic crayon, it's called. Or you could take them and put them in between two papers and like use a hairbrush or hair dryer. And then create art that way. So there are things you can do with it, and I think it could be a really fun way to like show that these items that you might think are trash can actually be creatively repurposed. Residential waste. I just quickly want to show, I always get asked like, what is my best find? This is a Russell Wright punch bowl that I found in the trash. I did sell it, and it generally sells for a couple of $1,000s. It's from the 1930s, and it is in the permanent collection of like one of the New York City design museums. So individual suggestions for things. I don't really want to talk about residential waste because there are definitely things that we can do there, but I think that corporate waste and school waste are areas where you can get a little bit more of a bigger bang for your buck because you're dealing with institutions. But things you could do: join your local Buy Nothing group. So on Facebook, search Buy Nothing and your area. And it's a local community group all about gifting. No money is exchanged. People give and receive from their abundance. And I love it, especially like I have a niece and I've gotten so many. I got her diaper changing table. I got a mini kids kitchen from there. It's great, especially with little kids, because kids outgrow so many items really quickly. Make a vow not to drink or use single-use water bottles in places where tap water is drinkable. Having drinkable tap water really is like, it's a privilege, and many places in the world don't have that. When I travel to places that don't have, tap water that's drinkable, I do use bottled water. But because my health ultimately is the most important thing to me. But here in the US, for the most part, we have safe drinking water. So take advantage of it and make a vow that like you're only going to use reusable bottles. Also, you can, and then once you have a small action, you could also add on it. So make a vow not to drink or use single-use coffee cups, and that's something that I have regardless of where I am in the world. And I have had instances where I'm standing in line at a Starbucks or a Dunkin' and waiting to get coffee with my reusable bottle, and they have rejected me at the end. They said, no, they don't accept it. And in those instances, I walk away, even after spending 5 minutes in line, because I made this vow to myself. Join an existing environmental group that's working on an issue you're passionate about. And again, I think that when you join the group and do something in community, it's another instance of getting a greater bang for your buck, because you can create change on a much larger scale than anything you can do as an individual. So some examples are Beyond Plastics. They also offer an amazing course. If you Google Beyond Plastics Bennington, um, that you can audit for $100, and it teaches you like everything you ever wanted to know about plastic and more. I really recommend taking it if you're interested in the issues with plastic, particularly about public health. 350, and both of those have regional chapters. Sierra Club, your local community garden, your local community compost site. But I have found that I meet some of the best people who I really enjoy working with because we're so aligned in these environmental groups. And it's a genuine pleasure to work with them because we're working towards a common goal. So I really recommend joining that. It can create a lot of meaning in your life. Hold on. Get to know your local elected officials. I've done work with Save Our Compost Coalition in New York City, and we have been really successful in advocating for composting. And we found that the hierarchy of contact is asking for an in-person meeting. You could get coffee, you could get lunch, you could visit their office, asking for a virtual meeting, making a phone call, and then sending an email. So whenever possible, try to make sure they know who you are, and make sure you know who they are. Make sure you know what bills they're sponsoring. Ask them to introduce new legislation. Ask them to sign on to existing legislation, and try to go for that in-person meeting. An email is good because you're creating that written record, but they receive a bunch of emails. They don't respond to all emails. Phone calls are much better because if a staffer receives 20 calls, even 5 calls in one day about a particular issue, they will report to their boss and say, like, I just spent an hour or 2 hours on the phone with all these people calling me about this. So you really get their attention that way. Testify at hearings, which can be a pain because hearings last for a long time, but that's another important way in which you get your voice heard. And show up at rallies. Rallies are really important. Bring signs, be visual, because they do receive press coverage, and that's something that elected officials do care about and pay attention to. Quickly, I'll go over some recently passed New York City waste bills. Ditch the useless utensils, which is skip the stuff. I think you have that here also, but basically it's saying that restaurants can no longer automatically add these single-use plastic or whatever material, utensils, chopsticks, ketchup packets, napkins. You have instead a checkout, you could specify the exact number that you want, then they include it. And if there's a grace period, and then if they actually do include those items afterwards when you didn't request them, they can be fined for that. This passed, and I mean, it's a really simple piece of legislation, and the restaurant industry actually wasn't opposed to it because they do end up saving money by not having to purchase these items. Mandatory universal accessible organics collection. This has been a dream for a lot of people in New York City for decades, and it's finally happening. And I think a lot of that success was based off of, in passing this bill, was based off of the grassroots support from the Save Our Compost Coalition and from politicians recognizing that actually this composting is something that's very popular and people want to do. So now everywhere in New York City is going to get curbside composting by 2024, I think it is, fall 2024. Potential waste bills, microplastic testing in tap water. This is something that I want to see, just because I think the very first step is is measuring. I think that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And right now, we have microplastics everywhere. Microplastics are really tiny pieces of plastic that are about like the width of a single strand of hair. And they're in our air, they're in our water, they're in our salt, they're in our food, they're virtually everywhere on this planet. But we're not measuring it. So we don't know if in our drinking water, the amount of microplastics has increased over time. We don't know if they're trends based off of season. We don't know if it's there are different things according to borough. We did initial testing at the Manhattan Solid Waste Advisory Board and found there were more microplastics at a site in Queens than in Manhattan. And then once you do those testing, it raises questions like, why is that? And how can we mitigate it? So it was introduced by the head of sanitation committee, and we've been phone banking for it, and I think we have like a super majority so that it should pass when it eventually is brought to a vote. And there's still things to be determined with this, like which water sources, using what methodology, and then afterwards, what type of limit do we want to set? But I see this as the very first step to addressing our microplastic contamination. And you could see that, it's across the world that you have microplastics, but for some reason in the United States, there's 4.8 fibers, and that would specifically be from clothing and from the discharge from washing machines, a lot of that, which is more than in other countries. So when you're measuring it, then you get to highlight that there's a need for these different solutions. Donate, don't dump for hygiene items. This is a bill that I'm very happy was introduced in New York City Council. And I'm proud to say it was a lot because of me posting about it and saying this is outrageous. And so thank you. That's very sweet. Um, it's not close to passing, but like even the introduction of it is a positive thing. And so this would apply to tampons, pads, toothpaste, lotion, shampoo, conditioner. All these items are really in need by shelters, more so than food. Food is actually relatively easy for shelters to get because we overproduce, but these items, a lot of times they have to pay for out of pocket. So this would make it mandatory for these retailers to have to donate these items. Other things I'm advocating for as part of the Manhattan Solid Waste Advisory Board. More water bottle refill stations in stadiums and public parks. I don't know if any of you have gone to a concert at MSG, Madison Square Garden, recently, but if you bring your reusable water bottle, there are virtually no water fountains. When I go there, I have to refill it in the bathroom sink, which feels really gross. And I imagine it's the same water source, but like it might not be potable. So we really need more refill stations. And we could say, according to the building code, you have to have a certain number of bathrooms for occupancy. So you could say, according to the building code, you have to have a certain number of water bottle refill stations based off of occupancy. And so it really increased that at stadiums. And it's also outrageous that the alternative is buying an $8 bottle of water. And increase the number in public parks. So like my future is you just walk around with your reusable bottle and you're able to refill it in a bunch of different places. And that's how you drive behavior change, because you make it convenient and public for people. Sit down restaurants and cafes must have reusables. So this would be another bill that was introduced recently. There's no reason if you're having people sit and eat a meal that you should be using single-use disposable items. And so if you're serving food, if you're serving drinks, you should be required to have reusables. And this would also hopefully transform Starbucks and other cafes where they have to have reusables on site. Sit-down restaurants and cafes must accept customer-provided clean, reusable vessels. This will involve working with the Department of Health, but there is a way to do it where you avoid contact with the actual vessel. Just Salad, the chain actually does a really good job of training and creating protocol that's approved by the Department of Health. Store donation protocol, as I mentioned, for emergencies and for stores closing. So the emergency could be refrigeration fail. It could be that there's like flooding. It could be that there's a hurricane. But how do you make sure that these usable items in those emergencies actually get used, and you have to have a plan and protocol beforehand, because if you by the time a disaster strikes or your generator fails or your refrigeration fails, it's too late. Ban of disposing clothing in the trash. Massachusetts recently enacted this ban, and I think New York City could also do this. So 6% of New York City's residential waste consists of textiles. That's actually a huge portion. If you open, that means that so a third of New York City's waste is organics. A third is these recyclable materials, paper, metal, glass, plastic, cartons. A third is this other. And of that third, 6% of that 6% is textiles. Hopefully that made sense. So you could really reduce the amount that we're sending to landfills and incinerators if everyone's recycling, if everyone's composting, and if people no longer dispose of textiles in the trash. I find a lot of fast fashion in the trash, which is like, brands like H&M, like Shein, and also sometimes high-end clothing in the trash. So really, there are systems for reuse, and we can build even more systems once we start collecting them. Require, oh, require mattress recycling. This is something also the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection passed, or enacted rather. Hold on. But you can recycle the mattresses. You have to separate out all the components. That you could recycle the metal springs, and you can turn the actual fabric into what's called shoddy, which is used for moving blankets. It's used for insulation. So you can do it, and there's a really steep cost for disposing of them in landfills and incinerators because they're so bulky. Require parks to compost their yard waste. In New York City, the Parks Department does not across the board compost the yard waste, which I think is outrageous. They should be required to compost, and then it will also reduce the need for synthetic fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer it uses nitrogen, and it's not stable like the molecule, and so when you have storms, it can lead to nitrogen, and some of you might know more about this, but nitrogen runoff, which then leads to algae blooms, and it's really awful for the local environment. So as much as we're reducing the need for these synthetic fertilizer and generating our own compost instead, we're benefiting the local environment, benefiting the world. Okay, I have to wrap up soon. Prioritize composting over combined anaerobic digestion citywide. This gets a little bit into the weeds, so I'll leave that out. Expand the bottle bill, so to make it so that it's not just 5 cents, which was enacted, I think, in the 90s, but 10 cents instead. So more bottles will actually be redeemed that way, and to expand it to more different types of containers, like your wine bottles. Permanent community repair and swap spots. So we need more infrastructure. If you have a broken lamp, where do you go? If you have a broken vacuum cleaner, where do you go? If you have these items that you don't want, can you bring it to a swap spot instead of a thrift store? This is my last section. Larger issue is incrementalism, incremental versus transformational change, which is something that I do think about a fair amount. One is this myth of infinite growth, which was something I didn't even realize I had internalized when I was working at the investment bank. But this just shows that in 2000, we produced around 50 billion units of clothing every year. And we don't know the exact number because fashion brands, corporations are not required to disclose their volume of the number of units that they produce each year. But according to, I think this is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, it doubled in 15 years to over 100 billion units in 2015. And it's only increased since then. So we have this idea of infinite growth, which is absolutely not compatible with the limited resources that we have on this planet and with climate change. And you could also see that as there was this infinite growth, this doubling of clothing to over 100 billion units per year, you see that the blue line, the clothing utilization, went down. So we need to stop this fast fashion cycle. We have to stop measuring success in terms of infinite growth. We need a more holistic measure through which we can measure um, success. I love this quote. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. It's physically incompatible. And I don't understand why corporations cannot accept that or haven't accepted yet. There's literally no world in which we can continue producing, by 3% each year and measuring our success that way. This is what I propose. This is what I like as an alternative to our current economic model. It's called donut economics by the economist Kate Raworth came up with it, who's in the UK. But basically, we need to live in between the ecological ceiling and the social foundation. That's where we need to operate. So the ecological ceiling is not just climate change, which is something that I think is, it's more talked about than these other things, but there's also ocean acidification, which is separate. There's also chemical pollution. There's also biodiversity loss, which is really scary. There's also air pollution, which we're finally seeing firsthand more, and how dangerous that is. So we need to be living below the environmental harm. But at the same time, we can't be in this shortfall area. We need to make sure that everyone does have water, food, health, education, a political voice, all these good things about what makes a society. And so that's where I hope we can head to. It's a circle rather than a line going to infinity, which doesn't exist. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much. Great.
Do you have any questions or comments?
You're phenomenal.
Oh,
Thank you.
so-
There's a group that I belong to now called Too Good to Go,
Mhm.
and hundreds of restaurants. You're familiar with
Right.
it, but for people who aren't, hundreds of restaurants in the New York City area have lots of food that they don't want to get rid of. And at the end of the day, if you pay a certain amount of money, you're able to get what they call a magic bag for about a third of the cost of what it would normally be. The uh, the Buy Nothing programs I belong to upstate, I'm in Bedford Hills. They also allow people to say ISO, so in search
Yeah.
of. So if you're not posting something that somebody needs, they're able to get it anyway. And then the other thing that I would love to see done in France, I know that supermarkets are forbidden by law to throw out their unsold produce.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you look at what other countries are doing and try to get similar programs enacted here.
Yeah. Thanks. So France actually has been leading the way with some of this environmental legislation specifically focused on corporate waste. I think one issue is enforcement. I think across the board, whenever you have a law, it's not the law itself cannot exist on paper. You have to then enforce it. And that's something that I follow some Instagram dumpster diving accounts in France, and it's not being enforced fully. And they're still discarding edible food, and and it also applies to retailers. And they're still discarding usable items. So I would absolutely love to see something similar to that. It could be with food. I also think especially the hygiene items and clothing returns, all these different items. But we need to make sure that once it's passed, it gets enforced. One example for that is that corporation in New York City, we have had composting laws for corporations that are of a certain size since 2016, and then they were expanded in 2018 and 2020. And it applies to any store that has 2 or more locations, any restaurants or grocery store, cafe. So actually a huge portion of New York City's food and beverage establishments must compost. Very few of them actually do. And it's really frustrating to see, like, Fairway does not compost, Citarella does not compost, D'Agostino does not compost. Starbucks is one of the few places that actually compost. Dunkin' Donuts does not compost, etc. So I love when you have these laws, but then you always need to make sure, well, like, how are we actually going to enforce it and make sure that the fines that they may receive are sufficient enough, or whatever the punishment is, so that they won't say, well, actually, I'll just accept that fine, and because it will cost less than actually following the law. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I've been noticing with clothing that seems to be an increase in artificial fibers, fossil
Yeah.
fuel fibers. How are they different from, let's say, cottons and
Mhm.
all, as far as uh, recycling? And do you feel that the fossil fuel based fibers materials are a much bigger problem?
Yeah, there's a lot of issues with fossil fuel-based fibers. I actually think that most people don't know what that even means. Like polyester or acetate, I think is, or acrylic. Um, Personally, I try to avoid that whenever possible. It's hard with swimsuits and with workout clothing. One issue is that it releases microplastics. So fleeces, those release a ton of microplastics into the air. And it releases also a lot of microplastics in the wash. So one thing we're working on at the Manhattan Solid Waste Advisory Board is a bill saying that future washing machines have to have a microplastic catch so that it's not released into the water afterwards. So that's something to do. Another thing is there's these health impacts where you're inhaling them or it's entering your water. And then even there was a study years and years ago about fertility and underwear, and they found that synthetic underwear decreased fertility, or I think it was like sperm count. So I think more and more we're going to find that these synthetic fibers, anything made of plastic, is really harmful to human health. And so what you have to do is eliminate it whenever possible. But it's for the first time, synthetic fibers became the number one, like, fiber source for clothing, more so than cotton. I think it can be especially dangerous for babies because babies are so vulnerable, and if they're wrapped in clothing or blankets made of polyester, then it's getting into their skin. They're inhaling it. They're maybe putting it in their mouth. I would like to see. This is not something I'm working on with MSWAP. I think maybe it's for the future, but I would like to see a ban of using polyester, synthetic fiber for kids' clothing, because I think we're going to find that it's really negatively impacting health. Another thing to note is that synthetic fibers and plastic are endocrine disruptors, and it can lead to, like, early onset puberty. It's the science, I would say, is not definitive, right? We're discovering more and more, but the more we discover, the more harmful that we see it is in very unexpected ways.
I had a question. So one thing I didn't see on the list for individuals, and maybe I missed it, was, I mean, you talked about getting to know your representatives but I didn't see vote.
Oh yes, sorry. Yes, votes. That's a good
Um,
one.
And I guess just what I want to say, when it comes to many of these things, obviously working with corporations, but in my experience, a a tiny little change to, state or city or national legislation can do more to, like, and you're right, you have to enforce these things. Enforcement is huge, but a tiny change that says all companies have to X, Y, and Z can save more, trash and all kinds of stuff than 99% of what any one individual could
Yeah.
do. Um, and I get concerned, not necessarily with you, that a lot of people focus on I'm going to go home and I'm going to be a better recycler, when if they actually went out and voted, that person who says they're going to be a great recycler, and then they don't go vote in city
Yeah.
elections, they don't go vote for local elections. And if a lot of people who cared about this actually voted for people that cared about it, I feel like it would make a lot bigger difference than me going home and composting, for example.
Yeah,
Not that-
I personally don't like either or. I try to view things as and. So like there's room for everything. There's room for individual, there's room for corporate, there's room for governmental. And then the governmental, there's the local, there's the state, that there's federal. So I view it all that stuff as and. I don't like to pit things against each other. But absolutely, yeah, I should add voting to that slide. Yeah, that's the very least I think that you could do as a citizen.
I have a couple of comments I
Yeah.
want myself. One thing is, if you go Craigslist,
Yeah.
the free stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, if I have things I don't want, an old lawnmower or an old tiller, I put free
Yeah.
on Craigslist, and people. It's a pain in the ass sometimes contacting people.
I know.
It up. But I give it away free.
Yeah.
And what you can do is you can put like a curb alert.
Yeah.
You walk down the street, you see something on the street, you take a picture of it, you put on Craigslist, you dress and say
Yep.
curb alert. And people, oh wow, this is a chair or whatever, a desk or you know. Another thing, because I work for wastewater in the city, and they're going to be digesting the food scraps.
There was, sorry.
They'll be digesting it, the food
Yeah.
scraps, and making electricity out of the methane
Yeah.
I produce. Are you against that compared to composting or?
Well, so yeah, this is something I didn't really go into, but I just mentioned. I personally am against combined anaerobic digestion versus composting. So in New York City, what we're doing now we have these bins that's across the city that are popping up that are orange and they're great. They say compost on them, but they're not actually being used for compost. They're being used for combined anaerobic digestion. So they're being taken to Brooklyn and combined with our sewage.
Right.
And so you're taking these food scraps, combining it with human sewage,
Right.
and producing some methane that for a while was being flared. It wasn't actually being captured.
Yes, correct.
Now some of it is being captured.
Yes.
But the end product, the biosolids at the end, no one wants them. They're pretty toxic. And they're not, they really shouldn't be used as like a soil amendment
Yeah.
because of the toxicity. And I think that like you have that system and the alternative is composting where you take it
Yeah.
and you create something positive that ends like reduces the need for our synthetic fertilizer and creates a lot of local green jobs. And so for me, I prefer composting over combined anaerobic digestion. There's a separate issue of just pure anaerobic digestion where you're taking the food scraps by themselves, you're creating that methane, and then the end result, the biosolids at the end are just of the food scraps, which will have like more of an end use than the combined with human sewage.
And just one thing, if you ever stop by the New York City a vegetable market,
Yeah, the grow and RC.
the waste is unbelievable.
Oh,
If you go in there, you pay $7 and walk around, the waste of the from this vegetable market is just.
you mean in Hunts Point?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's sobering. I mean, they throw just peppers and food all over the place because it's old or a few in the box are going bad. They toss the whole box out.
Yeah.
It's just, but what they're going to do, I'm sorry, what they're going to do is they're going to take a pipe from that Hunts Point plant, that market, and pump it into my plant down the street into the digesters. They make a slurry out of the
Yeah.
food and pump it to our digesters. That's the plan.
Yeah. I just the combined, I think we're gonna find more is like we shouldn't be combining food scraps with the sewage.
I wonder what your thoughts are about helping consumers change their expectations. I get most of my food from a ShopRite, and you walk in the door, and the bins of food are just overflowing. And clearly they're not going to sell all that.
Yeah.
But my guess is for many stores, they're thinking we really need to look this way to be inviting to people so they'll come in and buy stuff, right?
Yeah.
And you go over all the different places where there's things that we wind up throwing away. And I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are about ways to reach people that get a larger change going in terms of the attitude going into the store.
Yeah. Well, I think that we need a change. There's no way around it with climate change. And in the US, 40% of food is wasted. So and you could solve hunger and food insecurity and still end up with wasted food because we overproduce systemically. We have too many calories and not enough mouths. And so I think maybe when people understand that, they can be more receptive to it. I think there are also ways to like aesthetically change it, make it so like I've heard about using mirrors or not having a container be so deep, or you could have a smaller, like more of a farmer's market experience. Um, I'm very wary of corporations using a theoretical customer as a reason to not change, right? I think that becomes an excuse a lot of, well, we want to do this, but customers don't want to or will not respond to it or whatever without even trying anything differently. And I think that what I like to see is sometimes grocery stores have a section for extremely discounted produce that looks bad, right? Or I mean, it's not aesthetically standard. And I think that all supermarkets should be doing that because a lot of times instead they just toss it. So yeah, I think that we need to adjust, and some of the adjustments might not be easy, right? Of like walking into a supermarket and maybe they're not carrying, they don't have the same variety that they usually have. They don't have the same volume that they usually have. Um, but it, there's no way around it. So I think, yeah, I don't know. I hope that people can like understand the framing, understand why it's necessary, and adjust to it, and that supermarkets can like make it still can be creative and figure out ways to still make the experience like enjoyable.
Thank you for the wealth of information. I wanted to also say something about Beyond Plastics. It's
Yeah.
a really great group, and right now, I think they're taking signups for the fall class.
Yes.
I think there's still some spots left, so I would highly recommend it. A lot of people don't even know what plastic is.
Yeah.
They have no idea that it's a fossil fuel and it's a byproduct, that it's full of chemicals.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say, Materials for the Arts is a great program in the city. We have the same thing in Westchester. Up in Peekskill, there's Retake Remake. A lot of art supplies and fabrics are donated to them, and they sell it at very reduced prices, and they donate it to teachers and all sorts of community places. So just to you
That's
could know
great.
about it.
I wanted to ask about the composted, two things about the composting law that just got passed in New York City. So does that add any incentives for companies, restaurants to recycle
No.
or not
So
recycle, but
yeah,
compost?
so there's the Department of Sanitation managed waste, and then there's waste that the Department of Sanitation doesn't collect. It's private collection, but they regulate it. So this law only deals with Department of Sanitation waste that they collect specifically from residents. So corporate waste is a separate category. Yeah, is that the answer? Okay.
Is there any movement to add the restaurants to that?
Well, they have been required. That's the thing that's so frustrating. They've been required to since 2016. They started with large places, so large arenas and large hotels of a certain size. And then every 2 years, they increased the number of businesses covered. And so then they added on grocery stores or like a food hall of a certain size. And then they added in now foods like restaurants that have 2 or more locations. So basically, any place that serves food in New York City should be composting, but they're just not, and there isn't the enforcement. Um, and so it, yeah, it's very frustrating to have these laws, and then no one following them, and it seems like sanitation or whoever just like not caring about it. One thing that you could do is have more citizen enforcements, which happened with the loitering law in New York City, where if you find a commercial vehicle loitering for 3 minutes or more, you could take a video, submit it, and then you share in the reward for that. And so I think that, and people make money doing it. You get like several $100s for doing it. And then so all of a sudden you have people like violations skyrocketing and corporations paying more to that. So that is one model. If there aren't enough sanitation enforcement officers, you can widen it to the community and have people share in the reward for catching these repeat violations.
Is there I don't know, movement to increase the violations, or
I mean, I want it. What I have heard is that New York City is doing some commercial waste reform, specifically with commercial waste zones. So LA has a waste zone system. Other places have waste zone systems where they say, this is the area that you can operate. We're going to have 3 different waste haulers in it. Rather than having sometimes you have truck routes that start in Brooklyn and go across Manhattan and then go up Manhattan, then go into the Bronx. And over the course of just a couple of hours, and it really increases truck traffic and fumes and road wear, and it leads a lot of times to these companies like racing to get to finish their route, and that can lead to fatalities. And so they have created these different zones, and that hasn't been enacted yet. Like that hasn't gone into effect yet. And so what I've heard is that they're waiting basically just to do all this at once with the zones.
so just the last thing related to that. So the corporations must be destroying these things for tax benefits. You'd have new usable items, they destroy them so they can say it's damaged, and then they can write it off on
Yeah.
taxes. Is there been any movement anywhere in the world or here to uh, change that and make it so it's not a tax write-off, or make a benefit for donating it?
Yeah. I started it, and then I I I started I contacted different federal like Congress people about doing Donate Don't Dump Coalition, and which was specifically target those tax laws where basically you get a benefit for donating, but you also get a benefit for destroying, and you count it as a loss, and that lowers your taxable income. And the difference between the two is not big enough to incentivize donation over destruction. So Funko actually had a case of this recently where they make those like bobblehead plastic toys for Marvel or, Star Wars, whatever. And they destroyed millions. I want to say it was 20 million, like $20 million worth of inventory, where basically they had just like way too much inventory, and instead of paying for the extra storage, they destroyed it. And then yeah, they capped it as a loss and lower their taxable income. And I I felt like there wasn't the political will for that to change, and maybe will change in the future. But yeah, I think that if a shipment arrives, let's say it's like glass candles, and all these glass candles are broken, in that case, the corporation shouldn't be punished, right? And they should be able to like count that as a loss, lower their taxable income. If it was just these glass candles that never sold, why should they be able to destroy them and then have a tax benefit from destroying it? And specifically on our tax code, it says like anything that's not in style or in season anymore, like it's totally allowed. And so it's very arbitrary who decides like what's in style or in season. And I think it's similar to like fraud. If you have a house and you decide, well, I don't want this house anymore, let me burn it, and then I'll get it like a tax write-off and count it as a loss, and lower my taxable income. It's like that's arson. But if a corporation does that, it's totally legal somehow.
2 things quickly. I produced a play in 2011, 13, or 14, I can't remember. And I called material for the arts, and at that time, they only allowed non-profit organizations to get their materials, so it's not open to general.
It's not, yeah.
And, I think it's important.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
compost at our house, but there are certain things that before you compost, you have to see if you can use them, like example, lines. They're compostable, but they also help flower and plants.
Mhm.
So we started using, which is not, these are hand net, because the line so you can't get it.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
And so quick things where you can put little strips on top, turn around, and then you will water your plants.
Yeah.
And but you feel like you're doing something good. And I would pick up composting. What would really be for somebody like me, before you do that, see what you can use in community gardens, for example, scraps of potatoes, tangent potatoes. A lot of vegetables
Mhm.
grow from what people compost. So even though it's better than just tossing things, it's not the best thing.
Yeah.
I think that should be.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
I mean, but me, I just felt like driving down the yard and I roll it over and it's gone.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what my grandparents lived in Indiana, and on top of a little hill, and we used to have a food scrap bucket, and my grandma would be like, throw it over the hill, and I would just go out and literally throw it over the hill. And I'm glad they did that versus, putting it in the trash.
So wanted to add on what you're sharing about the feature that's another big that is part
Yeah.
I think that I through the end of what's happening lately, there's certain ways of looking recharge or system does this rather destroy ways of big cells with basically good just first restrict the supply of maintain an iron price.
Yeah.
Well, one question I had there's a lot of information that if there is one or two things that you thought could focus on, at least in a half of basic trials. I had heard a lot of excess religious waste. Some of that is just because or working 10 plus hours, making dinner, and so everything takes a lot of just. It's very few people I think have time for all of the things you discuss. So what can we focus on and I think
Yeah, I think, well, voting, as we said, that is, I think, the bare minimum. I think that focusing on systemic change is that is where you're going to have the greatest impact rather than on individual action. And so I really think finding that issue that you're passionate about and then finding a group that's already working on it and applying your skills to it. So for example, hosting events, planning events, which takes a lot of time. If you like event planning, that's a great place for you. If you're a graphic designer, that you could do the posts for social media. If you're someone who likes writing, drafting a press release or drafting a letter about an issue that you then have different organizations sign on to. That's a great area. So yeah, I think it's finding that issue. If I focus on solid waste. So it could be waste, it could be on air quality, it could be on electrification, it could be on climate change as a bigger issue. It could be on plastics. There are organizations that deal just with plastics, and there's so much there. It could be about textiles, whatever it is. But I think it's finding what you really care about, something that keeps you up at night, something that you rant to your friends about, and then getting involved in an organization that works on that issue, because the passion is going to sustain you, and the community is also going to sustain you. Mhm.
all about there. Yeah, just to be how like average this 1% is the other
Yeah. Well, so what estimate of plastic is recycled? In the US, 9%, according to the EPA, of plastic is recycled.
It's even less.
Yeah, it might have gone down to
All plastics in use, or plastics that have been put for recycling.
it's plastics produced.
Right.
So, and I would just like to say also that with plastic recycling, there's a lot to say about that, but there's one thing for people to know is that there's a lot of variation according to the plastic type. So plastic bottles, plastic like laundry jugs, those are really valuable commodities actually on the recycling market. They are likely to get recycled if you put that into your bin. A plastic sushi container, a plastic berry container, those are not valuable. Something that's number 6, those are just like not valuable, and that's a lot less likely to be recycled. So there's variation depending on what resin type they're using.
And this is a more abstract question, but you just mentioned plastic markets. You think of carbon trading. Where are you on like the because I love the Bolden quote, the Mad Men economist, one of my
Yeah.
favorites also.
Yeah.
Where are you in terms of your just core intuition regarding whether at the end of the day we're ever going to be sustainable within a profit driven market system, and whether we can really harness market principles or not? I'm pretty pessimistic. That's why I'm kind of depressed in life. But I'd be curious. You're obviously an activist, so you're probably more optimistic.
No, I'm not. I'm not optimistic. I feel like as an individual, you have to do what you can, and you have to still be able to like enjoy life and be able to. Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is that I find meaning in doing this, and so I feel like at least I'm doing something, and I'm creating meaning in my life through this work. But in terms of humanity's future, I'm not super optimistic. And what I do like to think about is just the life cycle of this planet. I like thinking about life cycles in general, right? Because compost is an example of you're taking this sort of end of life and creating new life out of it. So there are a lot of cycles of life, death, rebirth that happen on Earth naturally. And on a larger level, this planet has seen we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, but we do have this larger cycle of life, death, rebirth, with like millions of years in between each of those life form deaths. So that's what I like to think about, that the planet is resilient. The coral reefs actually went extinct in one of those previous extinctions, and then it took millions of years, but they did come back. So that's what I'm optimistic about, of the resiliency of the planet itself. Yeah.
That's it? No more? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.